Okay, good evening. So welcome everybody. This is our third class on the book of Job, and let's just catch up. And does somebody want to tell us what we've done so far? Anybody remember? It's been a couple of weeks. So our first session was a session about, it was primarily the prologue where God makes a bet with Hasatan, the prosecuting angel. And sorry, my dog is trying to figure out what to do with himself. So God makes a bet with the prosecuting angel to see, listen, this guy Job has everything going for him. Maybe if he didn't have everything, he wouldn't be as faithful to me and as, devoted to me. And he gets struck with all sorts of tragedies, right? So his cattle is killed. So all his property is taken from him. His kids are killed. And finally, his body succumbs to all kinds of horrible ailments and pain. But in this, yes, Sandy?
I was going to say she's on.
Who's on? Oh, Jane, good. Hi, Jane. We're just doing a recap of the first couple of classes. So Job, hi, Christine.
Hi.
All right, we're doing a recap. So Job loses everything, including his kids. He loses his health, and he refuses to do anything like curse God, even though his wife encourages him to do it, right? And then after we come out of the prologue, which is a prose prologue, we go into the poetry, which is 30 plus chapters. Job rails against this situation. He doesn't actually curse God, but he comes pretty close, and he says, I did nothing wrong. This is not fair. I want God to come down and explain God's self. And, we didn't have time to look at all of it, but there are many, many, many chapters where he says this, and he says, you know what, even if God does come down, there's no way I can win the argument, but I still want God to come down and explain God's self. The second class, we looked at the response of his friends who come to comfort him, but instead basically say to him, hey, you know what? If you're suffering, you must have done something wrong. I mean, nobody's perfect. And it's a back and forth. And the more Job says, I did nothing wrong, I don't deserve this, the more intense they get and the more convinced they are that he, in fact, must have done something wrong, right? And even just his protesting is enough to convince them that he must have done something wrong. So now, and again, we're doing this in 4 sessions. We could spend a whole semester on it. So we've only seen little bits and pieces, but now we're going to look at God's response. So we're at chapter like 38 or something. We'll see in a moment, because I'm going to share my screen with you in a moment. And we're going to see God's response. Yeah, 38. So God is now going to come out of the whirlwind and is actually going to explain God's self or do something. We'll see what we think of God's explanation. I'm going to ask people to mute themselves just so we don't get extraneous noise. And I am going to share my screen, and we're going to look at God's response. And then we're going to try to assess what we think about this response. Okay, does somebody want to read? Okay, Christine, please go right ahead.
I've never read as God before. But
okay, you're going to be God, yes.
If I get zapped by lightning while it's going on, you'll know why.
Okay.
Then God answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone?
Okay, so before we go on, let's just try to paraphrase this. What is God saying here to Job?
If you know so much, maybe you were the creator, huh?
Yeah.
Really.
Right.
Like, who are you to question me?
Exactly. Like I created this incredible universe, right? From beginning to end. And, who are you to, how dare you question me, right? You don't even know what you're talking about. Okay. So this is a continuation of when he just said, on what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone.
When the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped.
So everything is in a universe where things are in their place. There's certain boundaries and limits to things, and God is responsible for all of that. Which, if we had read more of Job's responses earlier, he basically says the same thing. He says, I know God did all the stuff. He's not stupid.
Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, so that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and it is dyed like a garment. Light is withheld from the wicked, and their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep?
So he's giving him a sort of panorama tour of the world, right? There's the clouds, there's the ocean, and, all of it took a certain amount of creativity and power and whatever. And this guy, all he knows is as much as a little pipsqueak.
Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare, if you know all this. Who has cut a channel for the torrents of rain, and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no one lives, on the desert which is empty of human life, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground put forth grass?
Okay, this is an important section here, because notice in verse 26 that God says that God brings rain on a land where no one lives. So what does that suggest to you? Anybody can.
It suggests the Siddur, where God says, worship me and I'll bring you rain, disobey me and I'll give you drought.
Okay, but in this case, there's nobody living there. So what is this about?
It's about like Job. Who's Job? He doesn't control. He doesn't even realize the scope of what God does or has done. And so, it's not just what human beings are doing. It's also everything else.
Right.
And you just don't get it.
And, the idea of bringing rain on a land where no one lives, like, what Jane talked about is the rain that we all need to live, right? To provide us with water, to water our crops and things like that. But here, God is saying, I bring rain in places where no one lives, which is beyond our understanding. Why would rain go to those places, right? So God is basically saying, look, you don't even have an understanding of how the universe works. I do things that make no sense to you, right?
Do you think God is dodging the question?
Oh boy, do I?
I mean, for Job doesn't care about all that other stuff. He wants to know why he's been ravaged.
You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. This is not what Job is asking. Job is saying, why did you do this to me? I don't deserve it. And he predicted actually that God is, as we know from the Unatana Tokef, God is, judge, jury, prosecutor, defense attorney, everything, right? That he's got no chance against this big, powerful God. And God is not addressing anything that Job was talking about. All he's saying to him is, hey, who the hell are you pipsqueak? Remember there was once a play called Your Arm's Too Short to Box with God?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is sort of like, you know what? try boxing with God and see what you're going to get. So absolutely, Ezra, we'll go more into that as we're going to analyze the speech and see, what we think about it.
Do you think that it might also mean that it's that although Job has done everything right and blah blah blah, but his hubris is what God's calling him on.
Yes.
You're saying that, and so there's something wrong with hubris, right?
So, you have to remember
what makes you feel so superior to grass or to desert land,
Yeah.
I care for everything.
Right.
I see it more like it's an abusive parent putting down a child who has a legitimate grievance.
I would.
I agree with that. I'm not defending God here. I'm just trying to understand where God's coming from.
Right. Well, now remember something, and that doesn't mean that that's how we analyze it, but remember the poetry, which is 30 plus chapters, was written separately from the prologue and the epilogue. So presumably the whole thing that happened in the very beginning where we know that God made a bet is not part of this. However, someone put it together. So now we have to consider the two pieces together. Otherwise, all we know is Job is suffering and God's basically saying, what the hell, you don't have a right to question me and you don't have any understanding. This is beyond the understanding of human beings. Unfortunately, we have the prologue and we know better.
Yeah.
And yes, with the prologue, God is definitely dodging the bullet here, dodging the explanation that, Job is really entitled to. Okay, let's a little further.
Can you lift up your voice to the clouds so that a flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings so they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the inward parts or given understanding to the mind? Who has the wisdom to number the clouds? Or who can tilt the waterskins of the heavens when the dust runs into a mass and the clods cling together?
So not only is God powerful, but there's a wisdom that's very deep, that's way beyond human understanding.
Mhm. Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their covert? Who provides for the raven its prey and when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food? Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars and spreads its wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes its nest on high? It lives on the rock and makes its home in the fastness of the rocky crag. From there it spies the prey. Its eyes see it from far away. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is.
So God is behind animals and nature and everything, and so this is just like, I have a lot to do. I don't have time for you, little guy. All right. Now here's the first answer, because there's a whole series of, it's a dialogue. First, God appears out of the whirlwind, Job answers, and then God has a second set of speeches. So Job answers God, see, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once and I will not answer, twice, but will proceed no further. So, Job is pretty overwhelmed by this response from God. I guess he's lucky on one hand in that God actually is coming out to say something to him. But as Ezra pointed out, it's not really answering the question. And as Harvey pointed out, it certainly seems kind of abusive.
Yeah.
So
it's also, Job might be a little relieved that he wasn't smote.
True.
by the abusive daddy.
True. All right. So let's see what the next part of God's answer is. Do you want to keep reading?
Sure. Then God answered Job out of the whirlwind, gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you declare it to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his?
So this is like beyond, God describing what God has done with the world, right? This is like Here, you're going to condemn me? I mean, how dare you?
Like silverback male stuff. It's like really, it's like the head gorilla pounding his chest.
Yeah, pretty much.
Look at Behemoth, which I made just as I made you. It eats grass like an ox. Its strength is in its loins and its power in the muscles of its belly. It makes its tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are knit together. Its bones are tubes of bronze. Its limbs like bars of iron. What is a behemoth?
Okay, the behemoth is the land sort of monster. There's a sea monster and a land monster. So there's behemoth and there's Leviathan.
Okay, got it.
And there
All
are
right.
two powerful forces, I would say forces of chaos. And we'll talk about that in a moment. There's just one more. This is a Leviathan now.
Okay. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down its tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it make many supplications to you? Will it speak soft words to you? Will it make a covenant with you to be taken as your servant forever? Will you play with it as with a bird? Or will you put it on a leash for your girls? Will traders bargain over it? Will they divide it among the merchants? Can you fill its skin with harpoons or its head with fishing spears? Lay hands on it. Think of the battle. You will not do it again. Any hope of capturing it will be disappointed. Were not even the gods overwhelmed at the sight of it?
Okay, so let's just stop for 1 second. What is God saying here about the Leviathan and the behemoth? Remember, there are two forces of chaos, one on the land and one in the sea.
They are totally out of human control. And
Are they under God's
Also
control?
they're
not
also
even under
part
God's
of the
control.
universe.
I'm sorry, Jane, what did you say?
They're also part of the universe. They're as natural
yeah,
as man.
They're natural. And if you think about Genesis, when at the beginning, the very beginning of Genesis, when God creates the world, there are these sort of forces of chaos, tohu vavohu. Remember that? And God is ordering everything. But in this story here, from this speech, God is basically saying that there are these two giant forces of chaos, and God is kind of holding them at bay. And that's about as much as God can do, which is interesting because that actually calls into question how powerful God is.
Yeah.
And actually, Harold Kushner, in the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People, basically says God is not all powerful, because from this speech, you can see that God is holding the forces of chaos that can become evil at bay. And that's about as far as God can go. But of course, as opposed to human beings who can't even do that much, right? God is able to at least keep them at bay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at a few questions. All right. What's the attitude that God takes towards Job? We've talked about that a little bit, but is there anything else anybody wants to add?
He's just a nit on the face of the earth. I mean, he's tinier than a little gnat.
Right. And, it's sort of, one of the ways people understand the relationship between God and human beings is God really like sitting there listening to each one of us asking for favors or for gifts? Or is God kind of busy?
Yeah, right.
So in some ways you could say, well, yeah, I guess, God has a lot going on. And, our little troubles are not what God spends God's time doing. That would be, one thing that people do believe that. Oh, gee, I was asking God to please help me, get this job. Well, God was busy. I don't know.
Yeah. I think Behemoth was before us in line. Oh.
So what is God telling Job about God's self?
He's basically saying he's all powerful, except for these behemoth and leviathan. And I thought it was interesting, especially one of the slides that you showed, that he talked about setting boundaries so that the sea doesn't drown us, and this doesn't happen and that doesn't happen. But there are no boundaries on God. God is beyond boundaries.
True.
That's what he's basically saying, you can't put the same boundary. I made boundaries so you can survive, but you can't vice versa.
Good. Yeah. You can't apply your limited understanding and your limited vision on to me. I'm a different kind of being. I'm not like another human being. And so this is, really beyond you. So we talked a little bit about why God causing rain to fall where no one lives. In some ways, it's sort of, we looked at this once before, the idea that God is paying attention to Job. So there's a verse in Psalms about how God is so attentive to us, even though we're just like mere little tiny creatures, God, is so concerned with us. But then Job takes that very verse and flips it around and says, why are you spending so much energy torturing me, right? And here, you talked about the need for rain and how if we obey the commandments, it's going to rain. But what God's is saying here is, sometimes I make it rain where it has nothing to do with following the commandments. It has nothing to do with that.
Well,
So
the covenant is with people, but there's so much else beyond people.
right.
And I think that's what he's trying to say,
Yeah.
Look, you're not the only tree in the forest, right?
Right. I mean, to be generous, you could say God is saying, look, there's lots of other stuff going on in the world. And it's not just about human beings or about you little measly thing.
Can I ask a stupid question about Behemoth and Leviathan?
Sure.
If they're representative of chaos and they're contained within these two entities, the sea and the land that God created, were they there before Genesis? Are they like elements in the great, blankness, and then they get contained and therefore get named and so on and brought into a human world?
This is a big question because theoretically we believe that creation is ex nihilo, in other words, from nothing. But it's very clear in Genesis that it says God's spirit was over the face of the deep, and there was tohu vavohu. There was something there, some basic element of, creation. Now, let me stop sharing for just a minute. Bereshit is very hard. The first word of the Torah, Bereshit, is very hard to translate. Let's just start right from the beginning. So traditionally, it's been in the beginning. So in the very beginning, how come there's all this stuff there already? How do you explain that? Okay. Now, there's another way to translate it, Rashi being one of the people, that grammatically, it really should be as God was creating, as opposed to in the beginning, in which case God maybe already created the, tohu vavohu and the deep and the behemoth or whatever was there before. And now this is the process of God creating the world. So it depends on how you translate Bereshit. And then, and then you have to decide, is it ex nihilo or not? And there's obviously a lot of debate based on how it's written and whether we believe that God created the world ex nihilo. If God didn't create the world from nothing, then who created that other stuff? But if you believe that this is the process during which God is creating the world, then God obviously must have created the material for the world.
Well, maybe the point is not whether or not there was chaos in general. It still would be pretty darn impressive as a creator being to have named it and therefore brought it into cognizance, brought it into a way of being understood.
That's true.
By naming it.
Yeah, that's true.
And when he did name it, did he say, this is good? Like he did after all the other creations.
It's
in other words, we have to grapple with the fact that God created chaos.
Mhm.
Why is chaos there?
Well, maybe they
It's
erased
so
the part that says,
destructive.
yeah,
It's destructive. He realizes how destructive it is that he has to keep it at bay.
yeah.
God has to keep it at bay, and yet he created it.
So let me suggest that, so God creates chaos. Well, let's think of chaos as sort of basic material from which you can build things. And then God separates stuff from the chaos, right? Dry land from sea, light from darkness, and then says it's good because God likes things to be in order. Or at least the people who wrote that particular story of the priestly group liked the idea of everything being in order. The idea, though, is if you channel this stuff appropriately,
It's okay.
whether it's through art or creating a human life or whatever it is, then it's good. If you channel it inappropriately, then it's evil. So there's a story in the Midrash about, Yetzer Hara, right? The tendency towards evil, that the rabbis trap it and stick it in a box or something. And then nobody builds a house, nobody has a child, nobody creates art. So it's that raw material
Mhm.
that has to be channeled properly. If you don't channel it properly, it becomes evil. So I think that's how I kind of understand the idea of chaos. And if it's just let loose without being controlled, then it can really run amok.
Mhm. So where
That makes
God
sense.
created chaos and pronounced it meh. You know,
Pronounce it meh. Okay.
meh. It could be either one.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions before we go on?
Rabbi,
Anybody? Yes, Lisa.
I was just kind of building on what Ezra had said about God avoiding the question.
Yeah.
And I was a little offended when he said, oh, you're going to put Leviathan on a leash for your girls because
Yeah.
God already killed his girls.
Ah,
It's another thing of God's not actually paying attention. He's just expounding upon,
Yeah. Himself.
what, rather than actually listening and answering the question.
right.
Boy, is
Right.
that's a really good comment, Lisa.
Yeah,
Thank
that's nice observation.
you.
Anybody else? I just want to make sure everybody has a chance to either ask questions or, oh my God, everybody has so many people have their cameras off. Hello, everybody.
That's right.
Okay, so we're going to go look at some more questions. Okay. Now, why does Job say what he says? I'm not going to say another word. Any thoughts about that?
How could he respond to it? No, you didn't create all this stuff. Yes, I am more important than you think I am. No, there's nothing to say. It's like, look, if this is your attitude, I may as well shut up.
Okay, good. Any other thoughts about this response?
There doesn't seem to be any sort of accountability from God's perspective,
Correct.
And so, I mean, in the absence of that, I mean, how do you respond to that? I mean, Job is being held accountable for his behavior in so many ways, but yet he's blasted, and really God doesn't seem to be accountable for anything that he did,
Good. I mean, I suppose Job could say, hey, wait a minute, buddy, you're not answering my question.
Yeah, right.
But after that display of power and everything, you're right. What can you say? We're having this dialogue at cross purposes, sort of like him and his friends too, because his friends keep saying, well, you must have done something wrong. He keeps saying no, and they're not really engaging with each other either.
Yeah.
Good. So why do you think we're going to go into the second speech? So Job just said, okay, I'm going to shut up. Why would God embark on a second speech at this point?
Because he feels guilty.
Okay, maybe God feels
Ooh,
guilty.
nice, Jane.
Maybe God feels guilty. Or, gee, I already pummeled you. I think I'll pummel you a little more. It's not entirely clear. I mean, this set of speech, this first speech is enough, right? So why is God gonna, hey, just in case you thought that I didn't give you enough.
Just getting back to what Harvey was saying, it is like the bad parent who's not satisfied with having driven the point home. They keep harping on it until the kid wants to scream again,
Right.
because it's just, oh God, this again?
So,
is this all
yeah.
I'm going to get from you?
Right. I said so, and that's why you have to do it, period, right?
Yeah, period. And then they say the same thing again.
Yeah.
It's
So
like-
we're not going to look, yeah, go ahead.
Is it also that God is disappointed in Job because he keeps telling him to gird up his loins, and Job just shuts up, So
Well, I
maybe
think he maybe
he's
is,
ready to go a second time.
right,
See if I can get a reaction out of the
right. Good point. It's sort of like he's itching for a fight.
Yeah.
Gird up your loins, just, try to show me how strong you are, right?
Well, it's
Yeah, we're not
really
gonna-
patriarchal, it's like, be a man, It's like,
Exactly.
The men that I know would find it obnoxious in the extreme if
Yeah.
somebody told them that.
So we're not going to look at the second set of the second speech because it's
I
very
have a quick
similar,
comment.
but I'm sorry, Carl, go ahead.
There's an item in logic it's a logical fallacy called the argument from authority. So old that it has a Latin term, but I forget what it is. And that's what this is. Hashem or God is trying to establish his authority, but in this case, it's relevant. It's irrelevant because it is a dodge and it doesn't address the question. And I'm a little bit surprised that the writer of this story didn't acknowledge that or would fall so easily into that logical conundrum.
Well, good point. So, as I said, we're not going to go into the second speech because it's.
Hello.
Oh, shit. Are you all there?
Yep.
We're
Yes.
still here. We can see you.
No, I touched something and everything went black.
Oh,
Oh, that's what happened to me at Rosh Hashanah a couple of years ago. It was like the most terrifying thing. But anyway, I'm going to keep my feet away from the outlet. So we're not going to look at the second speech, but we are going to look at Job's second response. And we're going to look at a number of different translations. Okay, so let's go. Okay, this is Job responding to God. And does somebody want, Jane, you want to read that?
Sure. Then Job answered God, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you declare to me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes.
Okay, before we get to the last verse, what is it that Job is saying here?
He's basically saying, I don't understand these things, but he's putting a tremendous gloss on it. Things too wonderful for me. I mean, is what he has gone through wonderful? And why
Well-
does he despise himself?
Well, that's what we're going to look at.
oh,
He's taking the point of view of God. He's not taking the point of view of himself.
Okay, well,
I don't think he means wonderful in terms of it being good. I think he means
It's
wonderful
odd.
in terms of it being awesome.
yes, I think you're
Oh,
correct about that. I
yeah.
think you're correct about that. I think he's saying, look, yes, I mean, you are this powerful being who created this world and it's beyond my understanding. I'm awed by it. But it's also important to say, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. That's important for the epilogue, which we'll get to next time. But in other words, remember, Job is very pious. He offers sacrifices for his kids in case they might have blasphemed God in their thoughts. But now he's actually having a relationship with God, and that's going to change his whole approach to God in the epilogue. And so try to remember this one verse here. I heard of you, now I see you. Now, that last verse, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. By the way, the book of Job is a very difficult Hebrew. It's very hard to translate. And so here we are going to have a whole number of different translations of this Hebrew.
Oh,
So the new standard version, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Those are very similar. The JPS, therefore I recant and relent, being dust and ashes. In other words, he's not despising himself. Like in the first one, it's like, oh, who the hell am I? Why did I, even question God? I'm an idiot. I should have just shut up, right? In the JPS, I'm gonna just take back my lawsuit against you and just let it go, because he's not repenting in dust and ashes. He is dust and ashes, right? That's what we've said that we are. We're dust and ashes. Stephen Mitchell says, therefore I will be quiet, comforted that I am dust. In other words, that explanation really gave me some comfort, which is pretty shocking.
Yeah.
How did that comfort you? But we'll talk about that in a moment. David
Well, I think-
Klein said, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think, he's saying, oh my God, I called him down to talk to him, to ask him and to demand an answer. And he's here and I'm flipped out completely.
Mm-hmm.
And he's driven home how much more important his actions are than I could ever even imagine. And here I am. I was created by him. I'm dust, I'm ashes, ashes also being, mortality. And I don't think it would be abhor himself. I think it's basically just saying, I am just a little critter on the planet. I'm just a little mortal being. And I'm awestruck. And
Yeah.
I think it's more than that. I mean, that's what I read in it.
Okay. Well, maybe the reason he feels comforted is, you're in charge. God, you're in charge. So I better just accept you're in charge. I don't need to question. That could be the response. David Klein says, therefore I melt in reverence before you, and I have received my comfort even while sitting in dust and ashes. Very elaborate, right? Then, therefore, I retract my lawsuit, because this has been a lawsuit. We didn't get a full flavor of that, but basically, Job is.
Daisy! I'm sorry.
So there is this lawsuit that Job is bringing against God, demanding that God explain God's self and explain this punishment. So he's retracting his lawsuit. Then therefore, I retract my lawsuit and repent of dust and ashes. David Perdue says, I reject, but I'm comforted over dust and ashes. In other words, I reject what you're telling me because you really haven't explained yourself to me, but I'm comforted. Who knows why? Then therefore, I reject my words and I repent in dust and ashes. In other words, I shouldn't have said what I said. And then, therefore, I despise and repent of dust and ashes. Some of it doesn't make complete sense to me, but so you can see where they're trying to grapple with what is it exactly that Job is saying here. I don't know if there are any of these that you prefer. Anybody want to comment on any of these responses? In fact, I think I have some questions here. So, do you think that Job is satisfied with God's answer?
No, I think he's just accepting it. Not that he's satisfied with it, but oh well, this is what I've got to accept.
So yeah, so one way to understand Job here is, you know, I didn't know what I was talking about. You're in charge of the universe. I'm not. So I'm withdrawing my lawsuit. I'm going to just accept what you're doling out, and end of the story.
And Job also doesn't have the behind the scenes information that we have from the prologue. All he has is God's response.
Exactly.
So when it says I'm comforted, when Job kind of says, it almost seems like Job's problem that hurt him the most was feeling singled out for this punishment. And so when God gives him this grandiose explanation of you are so small, it comforts him, because he's like, oh wait, I am so small. I didn't deserve this. It just, it kind of brings it back down a little bit.
Nice. And maybe also just the idea that, hey, God actually took time out of God's busy day to talk to me, right? How many times has God talked to anybody? As a matter of fact, after the book of Job, if you look at the Bible, the Tanakh, and you follow it, this is the last time God appears. You got a bunch of stuff coming after that, but no God, except maybe referencing God, but not God does not appear again after this. So this is the last time God is going to speak.
Who would want to talk to God after this?
Good point. Hang on just 1 second, Christine. So he may be comforted by the fact that God is taking the time to actually, bully him or whatever. Go ahead, Christine. Oh, you're muted. I muted you because of the dog screeching. Sorry. Can you unmute? Down at the bottom.
Unfortunate, because it is the last time. And, if the last time you appear, it's like you're berating somebody for like eons, and then says, so there, so who are you anyway, you little toad? And that's the last time he appears. Oh,
yeah, he's
really relying a lot on people's goodwill.
Yeah, the next piece is the Song of Songs. Comes right after this, and there is no God in the Song of Songs, not explicitly.
I think we're really lucky that God didn't respond this way when Abraham and Moses challenged him. Otherwise, our whole history might have been a little different.
Oh yeah. Although God did ask Abraham to sacrifice his kid.
Yeah.
So, but we have to remember who wrote the Bible. It was not God. It was human beings trying to understand God, right? Now, anybody have any other comments before we go on? Yes, go ahead, Lynn.
Just a little bit. I don't know about the comforted part in that translation, but I think it's like he sort of knew ahead of time he was going to get nowhere, but he's sort of accepting it now because, well, I got to give it a shot. Let it go. I mean, just can't do anything more than that.
Good.
So.
Okay, we're going to look at some commentators now and see how they understand this speech out of the whirlwind and Job's response, and we'll see with whom you agree. Okay, this is Arthur Peake, and he says it's the vision of God that has released him from his problem. Okay, I'm back. Did everything go black, or was it just
you?
Okay. I really got to keep my feet to myself. Okay. It's the vision of God that has released him from his problem. His suffering is as mysterious as ever. But plain or mysterious, why should it vex him any longer? He has seen God and has entered into rest. Now, I have to say, this makes me crazy, this kind of response.
Yeah.
Like, why should he be upset? God, you've seen God. That's good enough. But
his
since
kids
we know
are
God,
dead, but whatever.
yeah, his kids are still dead. He suffered horribly, and hey, but he got to see God. And then, but since we know God, we can trust him to the uttermost. By the way, this is a Christian theologian, just FYI. We know, incredible though it may seem, that the world's misery does not contradict the love of God. To trust God when we have every reason for distrusting him, save our inward certainty of him, is a supreme victory of religion.
Ugh.
Okay, what do people think about that?
No, thank you.
I agree, but maybe somebody likes it. Does anybody like it? No. I mean, this is basically saying God doesn't have to explain God's self. God appeared, good enough. And we have to trust God no matter what. But we know as readers, we know that God has made this bet, which is just awful. And God did not cop to it. Yes, go ahead, Carl.
I don't agree with, well, I agree and I don't agree. I think one can read the text of Job and come away with this impression of what actually happened. Although I don't agree with the vision that this vision corresponds to reality. And I don't see it as a helpful explanation of why we suffer. And I don't see that as, I'm an agnostic, but I don't believe that this is a relationship with God that I would aspire to.
No, I would not either. But, this is sort of a very traditional religious response, which I have to say does not take into account what we know about the story. It's only really looking at, well, we'll see some more of this. All right, Martin Buber. Even though normally Martin Buber says things that I agree with, but not here. The speech declares a divine justice, not the divine justice, but a divine justice. The creation of the world is justice, not a recompensing and compensating justice, but a distributing, a giving justice. God, the creator, bestows upon each what belongs to him. So in other words, yeah, go ahead.
I can't even imagine what justice would be in this circumstance, right? When you just like God disappears and Job is left with his boils and his dead children and everything, it's like, really, this is justice?
Again, the explanation would be that this is divine justice, which is beyond our comprehension.
No kidding, it's beyond my comprehension.
Really. And I will say one thing, that if we insist on somebody's got some noise going on. Yeah. Thank you, whoever turned that off. Okay, so if we insist that, the Deuteronomic theology is what we're living by. In other words, if we obey God's commandments, God will do good things for us. And if we don't, we'll be punished. Then in some ways, that really does limit God's freedom, right? It means that God must recompense if you follow the mitzvot, and God must punish if not. And it doesn't give God a lot of leeway. That doesn't mean that the story gives us an alternative that we're happy with, but I'm just saying, that's what Buber is saying here. It's not a recompensing and compensating justice. Well, each person gets what belongs to him. I don't know what he means by that, because that's really disturbing. That's not what Job really should have deserved. And we'll see more in the epilogue, but okay. Leo Perdue. Behemoth is a creature whom Yahweh, that's the scholarly way of speaking about the God of Judaism. So Behemoth is a creature whom Yahweh has made and who in the theopoetic realm of myth and ritual symbolizes the power of chaos. One of the functions of the Behemoth section is not to assert that God wreaks havoc in creation, but that the powers of darkness are mighty and fierce and must be intimidated and confronted to keep the world from entering the realm of oblivion. God limits, but does not eliminate chaos from reality. Can Job see this as a new revelation, which would allow him to praise the God who either provides a place for chaos in the world or is not powerful to remove it from reality? This becomes a fundamental question of the book. So somehow what Leo Perdue is saying is there's this chaos in the world and God can't get rid of it. God can only kind of control it. And thus these terrible things happen to us because of these powers of darkness. However, we know darn well that that's not why Job is suffering, right? So, again, if you look at just the poem and forget the prologue, then, okay, maybe you come up with this conclusion, but frankly, I don't find it very satisfying. to tell us that, hey, bad things happen, accept it. God does as much as God can, and that's the end of that. I don't know. Is that a satis? Let me just stop sharing for a second. Do you find that a satisfying kind of understanding? Because, frankly, in the world as we know it, there are bad things that happen.
Yeah, but they're not necessarily bad things that are inflicted by God to win a bet. I mean,
Right.
that's like really disgusting.
Took the words right out of my mouth.
But okay, so let's forget the prologue for right now. Let's just look, because we're looking at how to explain evil in the world. So this is, as I said, the Harold Kushner understanding is that God can only do so much, because what Kushner says is we assume that God is all good and all just, and that God is all powerful. Those two things cannot be true if there is evil in the world and innocent people have to suffer. So we can't get rid of God being all good and all just, because then what's the point of God? So we have to get rid of God as all powerful. So let's just say, forget the whole context of the story. We're trying to understand evil in the world. Now, so Harold Kushner, who lost his teenage son to a very rare disease, and he's a conservative rabbi trying to grapple with this. And he says God can only do so much. Some things are going to get out of hand. Is that a satisfying explanation of theodicy, which is bad things happening to good people, even though God is just? Does that work as an explanation? Forget the prologue for the moment.
I don't think that there are going to be any explanations that are going to 100% explain this. The whole core of Job, as you said, is about evil in the world, and it's been shown in the book that it's very hard to explain. If you can't explain evil, then it's one of those perennial questions where you can never fully explain it. And I think people will come up with explanations. And I think if we want to comfort ourselves, we will just cherry pick our way through it and say, oh, I like this, I really like this idea. And with another author, I really like this idea. But so far, I haven't found anything that speaks to me in any of the people you have presented.
Okay. So, I mean, we have a few different explanations that we've come across. One was the Midrash, if you remember, that said that Job was a counselor to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And when the Pharaoh wanted to do horrible things to the Israelites, he didn't speak up. So therefore, he deserved his punishment. So that's the Deuteronomic explanation. Again, forget the prologue for the moment. Just trying to explain evil in the world. So that was one explanation, that if you do bad things, you'll get punished. Maybe it'll be in a different life, who knows? But, he didn't speak up, therefore he's guilty of standing by the blood of his neighbor, basically. We have the idea that, we just trust God no matter what, because God is in charge of so many things. Divine justice is beyond our comprehension. And therefore, we just trust that God knows what God's doing. And maybe we don't understand it. Maybe after we die, we'll understand it, or who knows what. We also have the explanation that God is limited in God's power. God can only do so much. So those are three possible explanations at this point. Again, forget the prologue for now, because we'll get back to that. But, these are just attempts to explain evil in the world, which, there are a lot of different attempts in the book of Job. And every time you come up with one explanation, it gets undercut. Like, in the prologue, it's, gee, there's a bet being made. That's not fair. Then in the friend's response, it's, well, no, you must have done something wrong. I mean, and every time you think, oh, we're done with that explanation, but wait till you get to the epilogue. Okay, let's see if people have, if any of these, go ahead, Regina, and then Lynn.
Yeah, the one that I think speaks to me the most is Kushner's that God can only do so much, and there's going to be other things that are happening, and God can't be in charge of everything all the time, and he can't be doing everything. And so sometimes bad things just will happen. It's not your fault. It's not his fault. It's just going to happen.
Okay, good. So with that explanation, you could see why maybe the translation of Job's response is that Job is comforted. Okay, great. Lynn, and then Christine.
I basically agree. My ideas on this are sort of vague, but I think Kushner comes closest. But you also have to remember, like, just human nature and the existence of free will. Just that all by itself, things are going to happen that are not just.
Exactly.
What about ALS?
That's not just. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, that's biology. That things just, that he's not in control. The details, I don't know, but
Okay.
There's so much evil in the world. But the way I feel is that it's such a tragedy, but the deeper tragedy, maybe I don't know how I would change it. I don't know if I would change it to a world where everyone is rewarded or punished on the basis of what they do.
Right.
Maybe you should consider a few sessions on why good things happen to bad people.
Yeah. No, but it is kind of a mechanical justice to say, if you're good things will happen. If you're bad. It's kind of mechanical, and that's not all that attractive either, right? I may do a class next year on God.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
So Christine?
In the back of my head always is, so what does this have to say about the Holocaust, right? The great suffering of Job on a mass scale. And to me, the comfort that Job finds, or that's purported by some of the commentators that Job finds, is perhaps that because God is doing all this other stuff, that really it's up to human beings to try to resolve what they can resolve. And that the evil is humanly created, and it's up to us to do what we can to stop it.
And that's what the epilogue is going to suggest.
Yeah, and so, there it is, and there are these circles, chaos creates one circle with nature, viruses, things that are like really not all of them humanly created. And then, there's one realm of bad things happening to good people. And the other are these horrendous structures that humans create that are murderous and, and torture people and all the rest of that stuff. And so the comfort is, it's not God's doing. He's not going to bail us out because it's not that kind of justice. And it's up to us to do what we can do. And if it isn't enough, oh, well, we've tried.
Good. All right. Any other comments or reactions? Because we have a few more commentaries that we're going to look at. All right. Let me share the screen and look at Robert Alter. The Robert Alter said, and he's speaking about God's speeches, the imposing vision of a harmonious order to which violence is nevertheless intrinsic, and where destruction is part of creation, is meant to confront Job with the limits of his moral imagination. A moral imagination far more honest, but only somewhat less conventional than that of the friends. Because you know what? The friends are saying you must have done something wrong, and Job is saying, no, I didn't. Therefore, he believes in the Deuteronomic theology, right? Since I didn't do anything wrong, I shouldn't be going through this.
Yeah.
God's poetry enables Job to glimpse beyond his human plight an immense world of power and beauty and awesome warring forces. This world is permeated with God's ordering concern. But as the vividness of the verse makes clear, it presents the human eye a welter of contradictions, dizzying variety, energies and entities that man cannot take in.
Ooh,
Any
like
thoughts
this
about this? He's basically,
like this.
look, God is showing you the gorgeousness of the world. And God is doing it in poetry. And so, hey, you know what? Look at this world. there's so much beauty out there, and you got your little stuff going on. You know, that's just a small thing. And you can't even imagine the rest of the world, like where it rains, where there are no people.
Mhm.
And yeah, there's some crappy things that happen, but it's overall this beautiful universe. So thoughts about that particular approach?
Well, it kind of I actually really like what he has to say here, but it also reminds me of Kali, the Hindu goddess who is both destruction and creation. And the British, of course, could only see the destructive end of it. And yet she's both. So you can't, in the frame of Kali, the destruction cannot destroy everything, but there will always be creation. And that, she has bloodthirsty parts, and she has life-giving parts, and so on and so forth. It's not dualistic in a crude sense, but it's both at the same time. And you can't really grasp it if you're just a human being. So, it's that kind of an image of creation and destruction. And that's
Okay, great.
I think Kali's probably the best example outside of our tradition.
Great. That's an interesting comparison. Any other thoughts from people? I have to say, this made me crazy. I love Robert Alter, but this made me really crazy because, I'm with Ezra. No, this has been abusive. I don't find the speech to be about gorgeous beauty. I find it to be like slapping slapping Job right in the face. Like, hey, you know what? You think that I care about you? No, I care about places where no human beings live. Like, and you're just, who are you to question me? So I don't find this very, satisfying. But if others do, that's okay, because, different strokes.
Yeah.
My vision of God, I like when Abraham argues with him,
Yeah.
and argues, that he can talk to him, and it's not just bad things happen.
Right.
That mankind has something to say too.
Yeah.
Well, here Job does argue with God, but God does not really, engage in a real response. All right, we have a couple more to go. So let's go on to Atalia Brenner. So God is in fact conceding that he cannot dispose of the wicked and of evil. If so, God is not absolutely omnipotent. He rules the world he has created, but has little or no control over evil. Consequently, suffering, the result of evil, may be generated without his being able to put a complete stop to it. So that's the, kind of Kushner thing of, God can't control all of this, which, again, I think that might be a little bit more satisfying to people than, gee, look at the beauty of the world and we just have to trust God no matter what. Again, the prologue has to be looked at as well, because, this is not really what's going on, but, we'll talk about that at the end. Now, I will share with you my favorite commentary. He actually understands Job's response very differently. He claims that Job merely goes through the pretense of submission, knowing he has exposed the true nature of God, i.e., an abuser of power. For Wiesel, Job is the ultimate revolutionary. In his view, Job continues to question God, but silently, because he realizes that it's pointless to continue an open battle with such a superior opponent. And what he does is he compares Job's response to the response of people who've been tortured by governments, and let the governments hang themselves up by their own petard. I don't need to say what happened. You talk about what happened. Here, God is talking about what God did. And Job doesn't need to say one more word like, you big fat bully, right? Because God is making it very clear that God is a big fat bully. So I love this. You may not, but I happen to love this because I think this is what's going on. I mean, at least in the story, I'm not saying that's what I think God is in real life, but in the story, God is a big fat bully and is abusing God's power and coming back and just saying, hey, you know, who the heck are you? You know, leave, don't even try. And I don't think that's what we're meant to do in the world.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Christine.
I love it. So, but gosh, I wish he were still with us, you know, in person. But one of the things that I'm getting from him, but also I wanted to get at from the book of Job, which is that Job realizes when he's basically being told that he doesn't matter at all, and that who is he to question superiority and the power, is that the pursuit of power is impossible to argue with. You either like buy into it or you back off and say, this is not what it's about. And I think that you know, this notion that somehow he's a superior being, he's just proven that, you know, he's always ranking things and making it superior and inferior and superior and inferior, and that is ungenerous on the one hand, but also, you know, if you are a godhead, you're supposed to be all inclusive, and you can't do that if you're in the pursuit of power or demonstrating power.
Right. Other comments? Carl, go ahead.
I think that we may be imposing on the story our own sort of wish fulfillment. I think that it is a story about authority, and we ought to submit to authority without question, to religious authority, to God without question, and just get on with our lives and don't worry about the rest. I think that's the message, but I don't agree with the message. I think, like I said before, that is not the kind of God that I want to believe in or aspire to, but I think that's the message of the story.
I think
Can I add, piggyback on this, because I like what Carl's saying a lot, but also, you know, the societies that reject the kind of hierarchies that we live in, you know, they're called primitive because nobody wants to take them seriously. And but if we take a look at what their notions of control are about, of what passes for control or lack of control, there's a real distinction, and this is a little bit different from Hannah Arendt's notions of authority, but it's that power is associated with forcing people to do something. It's what we call authoritarian regimes, but it's a bad phrase. Just call them fascist. And you know, really, hello. But authority in those societies is something else, which is that you may be a repository for some forms of knowledge that you don't foist on people, but you're there. You're a repository. If people want to listen to you, they do. If they listen to you and they think that you're full of it, they walk away. And so that your notions of any kind of control have to do with persuasion, with kindness, with, you know, generosity, with all the things that the society basically pushes as virtues, right? And rejects anything that looks like power grabbing. In the Seneca, who had orchards and all kinds of, and planting and everything, they had better agriculture basically than the Anglos. And at the beginning of every growing season, the women would get together, and for that growing season, they would choose a boss basically, because planting, you got to coordinate it under one person or else it's insane. Okay, so, but it was only for the growing season and only for that task. Okay, and they never chose somebody who really wanted the position ever.
Yes, that's the key.
And this was, That's authority. That person had authority, that she couldn't force anybody to do anything. But if you wanted to have a good crap, it's good to get on board. And, that the social good was the aim of the coordinated controlled activity. And it was clear, and it was contextualized, and it was not transferable to other contexts. And so that authority versus power is what I'm kind of getting at. And you're absolutely right. I'm projecting all over onto this story because it's my right as a reader.
Well, you talk about kindness. I don't see any room for kindness here anywhere. And you're right. The best person to be in a position of power is someone who doesn't want it. Because otherwise, but I mean, it's not like, God is saying, I want power. It's just that God has it and is lording it over this poor little guy, right? Who are you to speak to me? And so Job says, okay, I'll shut up. But you're basically condemning yourself by your words, is what he's saying, according to Elie Wiesel. Other thoughts?
I like Elie Wiesel's blog there, or his essay. And it seems like the whole thing is written by a group of people who are under kings and that kind of authority. And at that time, as we read about David, the king doesn't like you, you say something wrong, you're dead.
Uh-huh.
And so by projecting that kind of baggage onto a deity, you're writing stories about a deity as if they are a king with the same kind of afflictions that kings have as well. Yeah. So
don't forget our metaphor for God is God the King, right?
Yeah, right. And I think it's all based on the people's experience who wrote this, who are living under kings and have to be, and being dominated by those kind of people. So what they write is based on their experience, which now we kind of don't have kings, sort of. But, so we look at it like totally like, why is this? It doesn't make any sense, but
that's a very good point. That's a very good point. That's what they know is kingship, and that's how they project onto God. Although at the same time, if you think about what it's like to live, there are times when it feels like there's some power over you that's forcing things on you that you don't want. And you have no recourse. What's the recourse? You get ALS. What's your recourse? This is not fair, right? So what? It's not going to change it. You get imprisoned by an authoritarian regime for being, protesting what they're doing. That's horrible. That's not justice, but it's happening anyway, right? And so I think it's again like the Unetana Tokef, who shall live and who shall die, who by fire, who by water. Mm-hmm. There are times when you just feel like there's some other power out there, whatever it is, imposing this stuff on you.
But if you categorize it, and certainly the incarceration thing would be evil, but if you have a notion of that, then take comfort in ranting, take comfort in doing what you need to survive.
True.
And without sort of perpetrating it on somebody else.
Right.
But that's okay. And I think that's the acceptance that Job had. Not this acceptance is, God doesn't give us a burden that isn't too much for us to do. That those trite things that keep dropping up on the internet that make me nuts. It's like, crap happens to people, right? And it's way too much for them to bear.
No, you're right, Christine. Maybe part of the comfort is just in saying, this is what is.
Yeah, it is.
Whether we like it or not, it just is. So we might as well just accept it, right? All right, I want to share one more thing. And this is, okay, so Echa is Lamentations. And Lamentations is about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. And supposedly it was written by Jeremiah. And Echa Rabbah is like Genesis Rabbah. It's a collection of midrash on that particular book. And so this is a different approach to God, how God reacts to the horrors that we have to go through. Let's see what you think about this. Okay, please share it. Yes, here we are. So here's the Holy One said to the ministering angels, come, let us go together and see what the enemy has done in my house being the temple, right? That's where God supposedly dwells. God and the ministering angels went with Jeremiah leading the way. When the Holy One saw the temple, he said, certainly this is my house and this is my resting place into which enemies have come, and they have done with it whatever they wished. At that moment, God wept and said, woe is me for my house. My children, where are you? My priests, where are you? My lovers, where are you? What shall I do with you, seeing that I warned you, but you did not repent? I am now like a man who had only one son, for whom he prepared a chuppah, but he died under it. So here, God has punished the people through the agency of the Babylonians. And this is the first temple being destroyed. And so he had to do it. God had to do this thing. But, you know, and it says, I warned you. Why didn't you listen to me? You know, it's sort of like a parent saying, I had to punish you, even though it hurts me more than it hurts you, right? And so God is crying with us. You know, God is so upset that the temple has been destroyed and all these people have been scattered and the city is bereft. Let's see what else he has to say. So do you feel no anguish for me and my children? So God says, go summon Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses from their graves, for they know how to weep. What I skipped was a little passage where one of the angels says, look, I don't want God to be crying. I will cry instead. And God says, no. So now God is looking to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses to kind of comfort God. So Jeremiah went to the cave of Machpelah. That's where supposedly, you know, the matriarchs and the patriarchs are buried, and said to the patriarchs of the world, and then the bank of the Jordan for Moses, because we don't know where Moses is, arise, for the time has come when your presence is required before the Holy One. When they inquired the reason why, the ministering angels replied, have you not heard? The temple is destroyed and Israel has gone into exile. They cried, rent their garments, placed their hands upon their heads, and cried out and wept until they arrived at the gates of the temple. When God saw them immediately, in that day did the Lord call to weeping and to lamentation, to baldness, to wearing sackcloth. So these people, these patriarchs, are coming to sort of cry with God and to sort of comfort God. At that moment, the matriarch Rachel broke forth into speech before God and said, Sovereign of the universe, your servant Jacob loved me exceedingly and toiled for my father on my behalf for 7 years. When those 7 years were completed and the time arrived for my marriage with my husband, my father substituted my sister in my place. I suppressed my desire and had pity on my sister that she should not be exposed to shame. I delivered to my sister everything she needed to trick Jacob into thinking it was me. And I even went beneath the bed upon which he lay with her, and I made all the replies in order that he should not recognize my sister's voice. I did her a kindness, was not jealous of her, and did not expose her to shame. So in other words, this is a midrash about Rachel, because remember, Rachel and Jacob fall in love, and Jacob has to work for 7 years for Laban, Rachel's father, in order to be able to marry her. And then at the last minute, Laban switches and puts Leah in the tent instead of Rachel. And there's a midrash that Rachel is under the bed telling Leah exactly what to do so that Jacob will think it's her. And if I, a creature of flesh and blood, formed of dust and ashes, was not envious of my rival and did not expose her to shame and contempt, why should you, an eternal and merciful king, be jealous of idolatry in which there is no reality, and exile my children and let them be slain by the sword? Immediately, the mercy of the Holy One was stirred, and he said, for your sake, Rachel, I will restore Israel to their place. And so it is written, Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. This is followed by, thus said God, refrain your voice from weeping, your work will be rewarded. There's hope for the future and your children will return to their own border. So Rachel comes along. Rachel. Actually, this is what's read in some places during the high holidays. The Haftorah is from Jeremiah. So Rachel is weeping for her children. So, her children have been exiled. And she says, hey, you know what? I wasn't jealous of my own sister. Why is it that you're jealous of these idols that were worshiped by the Israelites to the point where you exiled them and killed them and destroyed the temple? Have some mercy. This is, we're constantly being reminded that God always needs to balance God's anger and sense of justice with God's sense of mercy and compassion, right? Remember when God asked for a blessing, and whichever rabbi is in the ruins of the temple with God and says, well, what kind of blessing do you want? And God says, may my mercy overcome my anger. So we see that God gets angry a lot and God punishes the Israelites. And then God wants to restore the Israelites, wants to have mercy on them. So this is a very different understanding of how God sees God's own justice. That on the one hand, God is weeping with the Israelites, and God is looking for some way to redeem God's people. And it's when Rachel comes along and says, hey, I wasn't jealous of my sister. I helped her out. It wasn't fair, but I did it anyway. You're so much bigger than that. Why can't you forgive these people? You're jealous of little idols of wood and metal. So, God finally understands that and responds. So how does that work for you? The idea that God weeps with us and that God needs to be reminded by human beings over and over again. And as a matter of fact, that was the discussion that Abraham had with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. You're going to punish all these people? What if there's some righteous people in there? You're going to punish them too? Any thoughts about that as a different way that God might be responding to evil in the world and to destruction and to suffering? Is that more satisfying to know that God is crying with us?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, tell us a little more, Ezra.
Well, since you can't do anything about what's happened, the bad things that have happened, at least it's nice to know that he sympathizes with what we're going through.
Good.
Because I just finished Martin Gilbert's History of the Holocaust.
Oh.
And you get hit with the story over and over and over again of the atrocities and the tragedies, and a survivor going back to his home in Poland knocks on the door and he's shot dead by the people who own his house.
Oh my God.
So it would be nice to think God would weep with us, because it's obvious he's not going to put an end to all the evil in the world. So
Good.
we'll take what we can get.
And take what we can get, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Christine, go ahead.
Well, if solace is also a source of strength for people, for resilience, then God weeping with us is helpful for survival and survival with humanity. And that's, anyway, that's the way I see it. So I agree with you, Ezra. It's like, what do you do, right? At least he can feel sorry with us.
So here's something interesting. In this case, and in the case of Abraham and some other stories, God is able to somehow draw on God's mercy, thanks to the fact that a human being has said, hey, wait a second. You're not behaving the way you should be behaving as God, right? Here, Rachel reminds God, Abraham does the same thing. So Jung, the psychologist Jung, wrote a book called Answer to Job. And his conclusion, because he's a Christian, and in fact, he was an anti-Semite, I think, his response is that Job is more righteous than God. And for God to learn the lesson from Job, God had to become human being, as in Jesus. Now, of course, I don't buy that particular explanation, but that's kind of interesting. The idea that God has to learn from us just as much as we have to learn from God. I mean, there's a similarity between that concept and this Echa Rabbah, where a human being has to call God to account.
Of course, if God has to learn from us, who needs him?
Well, it's, we have a covenant with God, and a covenant is a mutual relationship. And it's sort of a dance. And sometimes we learn from God, and sometimes God learns from us. And there's something called process theology, where God is not, the God of Maimonides, which is, God is perfect, doesn't change and whatever, but the God evolves with us. And, there's a relationship between us in terms of the Godhead. And that's also kind of a Kabbalistic notion. So something to think about, that God might actually learn from human beings, not through Jesus necessarily, but go ahead, Christine.
That Rachel is oftentimes just sort of conflated as, another voice reminding God, but she's not just another voice. Her voice is the voice of connection at a deep level through, in this case, kinship with another, that enables you to go through something that ordinarily would be incredibly impossible. And so it's she's speaking this notion of not an abstract mercy or abstract compassion, but one that is rooted in connection.
Mm-hmm.
And that's her lesson. And that's, this is underneath all that, speaking truth to power, that's underneath all of that, is the voice of connection and compassion.
Well, that's interesting because, when you think about Job is yelling and screaming, right? And
Yeah.
Rachel is approaching it very differently.
Mm-hmm.
She's saying, hey, you know what? Get over yourself.
I think it's.
I got over myself. Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I think it's really interesting that the Midrash concentrates on this story of her hiding under Leah's bed, when wasn't Rachel the one that took the idols from Laban's house and then sat on them that
Yes.
couldn't find it? Like, wouldn't it have been more? Wouldn't she have talked about that instead? To say, oh, don't concentrate on these little idols. Don't worry about that.
That's
You're
a
bigger
good
than
point. But Midrash picks and chooses what they want to look at, and context is not necessarily important. In fact, they often take things out of context, but that's a very good point. Yes, she did take the idols. Okay, so we're going to have to stop for today. We do have Torah study on Saturday, and we will resume Job in June. I think it's June 2nd. And then we have one final Tanakh study on June 4th. So I look forward to continuing to study all of this with you. Good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Sure. Good to see you all.
Thank you, everybody, for all your insights. It's so great.
I've quoted it before. I'll quote it one more time. It's very difficult to love God, and God knows it.
That's great. Perfect ending. Thank you, Ezra.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.